If you have chosen, for instance, of free will to follow Christ and to have his righteousness imputed to you, to live by faith, then you will live within that framework and see the world in that way. Likewise, if you decide that it's the law, works, and deeds that you need to stand on before God, then you will view the world in that way. Along with those works, you'll notice you will begin to see your striving in comparison to others, and you will begin to look at the fruits of their ministries or lack thereof and compare yourself to them if you're in this sort of works-based framework, living in them, to use Paul's language. It's interesting. I've seen this at work. You'll tend to be nearly incapable of loving people at some point, and especially in a way that's like really other-centered, and you'll not really have a lot of joy and happiness. Now, if you walk by faith, I'm not saying it's easy or just everything is perfect, but you'll begin to change from the inside out, and notice that you begin to care more and more about others and less about yourself. If you live by God's way and live in this idea of living by faith, you'll begin to see things more and more like Jesus did. And you will see the blessedness of the poor, the blessedness of those that mourn, and be able to reach out to them and comfort them in a deep way. In short, you will begin to look more and more like Jesus if you were the man that doeth the law of faith and live in it, and less like the man under works. Chris?
Yeah, a real quick commentary sort of on just what you just said, this idea that you kind of become other-centered. I notice that it's really interesting when I talk to folks that are into some sort of, a variation of Eastern religion or sort of getting more enlightened via meditation or whatever it may be. It's kind of interesting that the further they go down that path, the more self-centered they become, even though the goal is essentially to be, to lose your ego and things like that. That's what they would all say ostensibly is the reason for it. But because it's like, well, I'm reading the right books, I meditate 7 hours a day, I do all these things, I've worked so hard on my spirituality, it's so introverted, it's so me-centered, the entire everything is them-centered as opposed to others-centered. And that's what the trump card of Christianity does, is so revolutionary, is that it is absolutely nothing of yourself, that no one can boast. I mean, your salvation is totally not something that you're doing. You're becoming humble almost despite your nature. And it's clear to anyone that's been saved that it's not them that's becoming more humble because they're doing the right things. It's that the Lord is doing more to them as they let him have more of them. Anyway, so we're continuing here at this verse. And the law is not of faith, but the man that doeth them shall live by them. Here, Paul is continuing in his routing them with more with Old Testament. This is a quote from Leviticus 18 verse 5 that says, "Ye shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a man do, he shall live in them. I am the Lord." And this is a really often quoted Bible passage. For example, Nehemiah quotes it, Ezekiel quotes it, Jesus quotes it when he's quoting Ezekiel. Paul mentions this later in Romans. So it's a very often quoted verse. And to really get after it, we're going to need to take a running start from verse 11. "But that no man is justified by the law in the sight of God, it is evident, for the just shall live by faith, and the law is not of faith, but the man that doeth them shall live in them." So this is saying that the law does have a way to become righteous before God if you can do the law. But it can't be done, and so we can't attain righteousness by the law.
It's technically possible, but not really.
And that's kind of how what Jesus did in a way, because thankfully that's the route that he took, more or less. He lived a perfect life under the law and attained righteousness under that law so that he could become the perfect sin offering for all mankind. And then God could then see us with Christ's righteousness, this idea of Christ's righteousness imputed unto us. That when I remember this story somebody said one time, it always stuck with me. This preacher was, all happy with himself or whatever, and he was asking, in the mirror, "God, what is it that you see in me? What is it that you see in me that you would do this great work, in me?" And like he was really humbled when, he said, "I see Jesus, I see Christ. I don't see you," But anyway, a few more things on this. This is a quote from Geneva Translator Bible notes. Here is the reason shown of the former conclusion, because the law promises life to all that keep it, and therefore, if it is kept, it justifies and gives life. But the Scripture, attributing righteousness and life to faith, takes it from the law, seeing that faith justifies by imputation, the law by the performing of work. Okay?
Awesome. Sounds good. All good stuff. Many of those things I wish I would have said. Let's see. Galatians chapter 3, verse 13. Christ hath redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us, for it is written, Cursed is everyone that hangeth on a tree. Now, one of the things that is interesting about this verse, obviously, is that it's quoting Deuteronomy. You know, most people say, it's quoting Deuteronomy. Well, yeah, of course it's quoting Deuteronomy. Now, if we go back and have a look at Deuteronomy, at chapter 21 specifically, we see that it is a unilateral command and really a comment made about those who have done evil and not good and are already hanging up there on the tree for it. It says that you need to cut them down and not leave them hanging up all night, because to do so then bury them would be a defilement to the ground and the land. Now, what's particularly interesting about this is the larger context of the chapter. Deuteronomy begins by talking about what to do if a child will in no wise, Deuteronomy chapter 21, that is, it begins by talking about what to do if a child will in no wise follow or honor their father or mother, and you just can't get them to do what is right. That's particularly interesting because we're talking about Christ here. Christ being redeemed from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us. If you follow this out, well, who followed the Father in heaven perfectly? Who did every single thing that the Father asked of him? Who lived so sinlessly perfect that the religious leaders of the day accursed him for having a demon? That they didn't understand it, you know. He lived a sinlessly perfect life, and the quote-unquote religious leaders, they didn't understand it. So they said, well, he must have a demon or something. That's how different he looked to people of his day. Well, obviously, that was Jesus. We can take this interesting, and yet even within this comparison of Deuteronomy 21 and the larger context of honoring the Father, we can take this interesting verse yet a step farther. Deuteronomy says you were supposed to take the body off the tree before sunset, not leave it up there overnight. And when Jesus was crucified, he was buried before dark because Joseph of Arimathea there had to be ritually clean for the Passover. Now, it's interesting that Jesus raised us up again as spiritual sons of the Most High, and though he may have temporarily blinded the Jews, as Paul says in Romans, they were not totally accursed. They were not totally thrown out, which is exactly the picture we get here from applying verse 13 to the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Chris?
Wow, that's really good, especially that you hit all that stuff with Deuteronomy, too. I totally didn't hit that, which makes now Paul 3 for 3 on these verses of hitting an Old Testament passage in verse 1, verse 2, or verse 11, verse 12, and verse 13 here. So Christ hath redeemed us from the curse of the law. And this is, I want again, this whole thing, if you read this in context, it's so unbelievably heady. I mean, he's saying this in this grand discourse to them, just hitting them with so much information. And I'm going to read the verse before this to sort of get the flow. And the law is not of faith, but the man that doeth them shall live in them. But Christ hath redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us. For it is written, Cursed is everyone that hangeth on a tree. So he's saying, Christ has redeemed us from that law via his his following the law. The word redeemed is, I'm not going to hit it right, exagorazo in the Greek. It means to buy, that is, ransom, or to rescue someone from slavery. It really has this idea of buying back. So Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law. He bought us back. So how did Jesus redeem us? He did so by having become a curse for us. This is another really great quote from Luther, and I don't mean to wear out his commentary on it, but it's very good. He says, all the prophets of old said that Christ should be the greatest transgressor, murderer, adulterer, thief, blasphemer that ever was or ever could be on earth. When he took the sins of the world upon himself, Christ was no longer an innocent person. He was a sinner, burdened with the sins of Paul, who was a blasphemer, burdened with the sins of Peter, who denied Christ, burdened with the sins of David, who committed adultery and murder, and gave the heathen occasion to laugh at the Lord. In short, Christ was charged with all the sins of all men, that he should pay with them with his own blood. The curse struck him.